So this is me, Jeff Campbell. This talk is called The Value of Options. I don't want to spend a bunch of energy telling you about who I am and trying to convince you that I know what I'm talking about, so I developed a little trick for this a few years ago. Can we all just agree that I'm well qualified to talk about this subject? Great. Excellent. That'll save us a bunch of time. If you want to know more and you want to actually check that information, then you can go to my website. You can find out more about me. The only important thing to really share, please be comfortable, we are friendly. The only important thing to really share about myself before I get going is that I know you can't actually tell, but I'm Canadian and not American. That's it. Yeah, thanks. This has always been really important to Canadians to point out, but starting to feel more important. What's that, sorry? English speaker. I do speak French as well, though, and Swedish. Yeah, so I'm Canadian, but I've lived in Sweden for the last 13 years, so that's like a third of my life at this point, so I don't know how much Canadian I am anymore. I'm starting to get more and more Swedish every day. I have a bunch of jokes about that in Sweden, but we'll skip over them here. So, the value of options. First, I want to talk about what problem we're actually trying to solve here. To put it really simply and really quickly, I think the big problem is that we get locked into talking about one solution too quickly. And I mean that in a really broad context. I don't just mean that when I'm talking about how do we build a technical solution for something. And I don't just mean that when we're talking about what's the product feature that we need. I mean it in all sorts of ways. When we're talking about how to make a change in the team, when we're talking about the output from a retrospective, when we're talking about the new feature we want to build, when we're talking about the technical solution we want to implement, I find that we have a tendency to get locked into one particular solution too quickly. So what I've started doing over the last few years is finding different tools that I can use to get more options on the table, to consider different things when we're talking about things. So there's a couple of sort of ways you'll notice if you're not getting enough options out on the table. Retros that only have one approach to solving a single issue. So if you're having a retrospective and you only ever have one possible idea for how to fix something, which is great, very good example of this is we're getting too many interruptions from support. Stop answering support when they interrupt us. Pretty good sign that you're having this problem. User stories that already have a solution provided, those are always fun. I'm sure we're all familiar with those, right? It's like we want to focus on the impact like Goiko was talking about, but the impact is only ever listed as build this specific feature. Only one solution discussed in planning. You'll see that your teams do this often, right? We talk about the feature that's required, and then somebody inevitably speaks up with the technical solution that they think will work, and then we talk about that, we argue about that particular solution. The people that do that is, there's always one person who always has who's always the first one to say something, right? This is people like me. I'll tell you a little trick about people like me. It's not that we want to always be the one speaking, it's that we can't help it. So when we're sitting in a room and it's quiet, I'm literally sitting there going, working so hard not to blurt out something first, but there's only so long that I can do that for. And if it remains quiet, I'm eventually going to speak. I just can't help it. It's just in my nature to do that. So you see this a lot, right? People like me are always the one who are coming up with the solution to the problem. They're always the one talking first. I've actually been training myself over the course of the last few years. I actually keep a count in my head, and I'm gradually trying to increase how long I can go without speaking for longer and longer intervals. Seems to be working a bit, but I will eventually break down if it's quiet. I don't have anything to add. When you go through the whole discussion, whether it be about a problem or a user story or whatever it is, and then then the Scrum Master does that thing where they finally go, Joe, what do you think about it? Put them right on the spot, and they go, I don't have anything to add. I'm sure you guys have seen this one. Or a Scrum Master or an Agile coach who tells you the way to solve a problem. This is one of my biggest pet peeves. And I did this for many, many years. Scrum says to solve the problem like this. The book says to solve the problem like this. We need to start using story points. That's the way that we solve this problem. I like to take a very different approach now. When I have a problem in my team, I always like to bring them options. I like to give them several potential ways to solve a problem. It doesn't mean I won't make a recommendation. It doesn't mean I won't say, I think that this is the best way to do it, but I'll give them those different options and I'll let them choose for themselves. So if you see any of these things, it's very possible that you're not getting enough options out on the table. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a mental model to think about these things. So some of you may have seen this. I've forgotten the book that it's from off the top of my head. But this is about how we create choices and make choices when trying to solve things or to have discussions. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to use throughout this presentation the example of a retrospective, but it's important to keep in mind I'm really not only talking about retrospective. I'm talking about solutions to technical problems. I'm talking about features that you're going to implement, all these kind of things. But retrospectives is a good way to give the example. So we write a bunch of Post-it notes. I'm sure you guys have done that. We discuss some of the Post-it notes. Somebody comes up and they stick it on the board. Maybe we do a little bit of grouping them together, whatever it might be. Then we vote. We do some kind of dot voting, or, you know, the loudest person in the room argues why their thing's the most important until we talk about that. However you do that decision making. But here's the important part. At this point, we've already started to narrow choices. We've already started to narrow what it is that we're talking about at the point that we vote. Then we discuss the solution, and the way this usually goes is somebody like me sits there quietly as long as they possibly can, and then they can't take it anymore, and they blurt out a solution. And then what we go into from that point is discussing that solution, whether we think that solution is a good solution or a bad solution. And we usually, what we'll only ever do from that point is make changes to the one thing that's already been proposed. People will address concerns. They'll bring up, I don't think that it's going to work because of this. And we'll find ways to fix that. But what we usually don't do is change entirely the thing that we're talking about. Sometimes, maybe, if it's a really horrible idea, we'll do that. But not very often. And then we agree to an experiment of some kind that we're going to do to try to make a change from the retrospective. So there's actually two things that are happening here. There's finding the right problem, and there's finding the right solution. These are the two different modes that we're talking about. Finding the right problem is talking about what the actual issue is and exploring it and understanding it. And then we vote to say this is the one most important problem. And then finding the right solution is about how we actually try to address that problem. So I like to try to take a little bit of a different approach. I like to go wide, come up with a lot of different options, both for finding the right problem and for finding the right solution, so that we're not locked into very singular choices. So we write a bunch of Post-it notes. We discuss the Post-it notes, then we do some voting. At this point, we've narrowed down the right problem. We have a good idea of what the thing it is we want to talk about is. Then, I like to go broad once again when talking about the solution. So instead of just the loud person like me shouting out the best solution that occurs to them, I like to spawn as many different ways to attack this problem as we can possibly think of. I like to spawn as many different experiments to attack this problem as I can possibly think of. So one option can have multiple experiments, and then I like to do the committing to how we actually solve the problem. I'm going to show you some tools for doing this in just a moment. Commit to it, and then we execute on the experiment. So the important thing here, and you're going to see this as we go through the tools, and I'll try to point it out on each tool that we talk about, is that there's the finding of the right problem and there's the finding of the right solution, and we want to go broad on both of those things. So why is this important? Well, I think I've mentioned this one enough. It combats people like me who are always the first person to speak. Building on each other's ideas is a really good way to come up with solutions. So when I hear somebody else come up with a solution, that spawns something in my mind where I might come up with a slightly different solution that they wouldn't have thought of, and I wouldn't have thought of without hearing their idea first. It gets us into a positive thinking mindset. So one of the things I do in the spawning of the right solution is I say in the beginning there are no bad ideas. Come up with everything you possibly can. This is very much a brainstorming technique. People who do brainstorming for creative work have done this for a long time. And I always like to get this started by coming up with the most outrageous suggestion I possibly can. So I'll often start with do absolutely nothing about it, which is an option. I mean, there's lots of problems that are solved by doing absolutely nothing about it. Make it worse. Could we make this problem worse? These are just kind of outrageous suggestions to get everybody thinking in that mind space of there are no bad ideas here. Doesn't mean we're going to do bad ideas, but we want to get as many of them out there as we possibly can. And this creates a positive thinking mindset. All of a sudden, we can balance different approaches against one another, which is something that's very difficult when we talk about one thing until we either do that thing or we shoot that thing down. Then we move on to the next thing. We're not actually balancing these things against one another. We're not comparing them for what's a better solution. And it creates buy-in. Everybody feeling like they've been heard and like they've had a chance to make their point, even if we don't end up going with the solution that they've proposed, it still creates buy-in from them because then they feel like they've been heard. It's really hard, I assume, because this has never been me, I assume it's really hard to be the person in the room whose idea never gets heard, right? That somebody always picks something else, you never even get to speak, or your ideas are always shot down. But at least, if you put everything up, if people listen to your ideas and consider them, at least that creates some buy-in. And there's a higher chance of finding the best approach with this solution. But that last point comes with a warning, a higher chance of finding the best approach. I'm curious, I know there's a bunch of Danes in the audience. I don't know if the Danes do things like the Swedes do, but anybody here ever worked with Swedes? Yeah. So Swedes have incredibly flat organizations, right? They do have some hierarchy, but basically they have very flat organizations. Everybody's important, and everybody's opinion is really important in Sweden, and I think that's a good thing. I'm not making fun of that approach. It's good for, again, creating buy-in and getting good ideas out there. The problem comes to when they actually make decisions, because the way that they make decisions is they have to get everybody to agree, which means they can't make decisions, right? It just goes on forever. Committee meeting after committee meeting after committee meeting until the rest of time, which is good. You know, at least when you finally do make a decision, everybody actually agrees with the decision, which is nice, but it takes absolutely forever, and it's not a rapid way of making choices. So you don't all need to agree is rule number one. Not everybody in the room has to think that the solution we're agreeing to is the best possible solution. We just need to look for strong objections. The way I always put this in my team is, does anybody think that any of these options are dangerous? Like, would this be harmful to our product? Would it be harmful to our business? Would it be harmful to you personally? Let's get those objections out there. We won't do things that are harmful. We won't do things that you consider to be dangerous or immoral. We'll cut those options out. But it doesn't mean that you need to think that the thing we chose is the best possible solution. And then treat these things as experiments, right? I can't really get into the whole Swedish culture of why they have trouble making decisions in this way, but what it basically comes down to is nobody wants to be seen to think that their idea is better than somebody else's idea. And the idea of experiments, which I think is a really noble way of thinking, but the idea with the experiments is really good because basically what you say is, none of us have any idea. We're all completely clueless. Let's try and find out. So really treat these things as experiments. Let's try and find out. And then pick one and find out, which is the point I just made. So let's talk about tools. Practically, how do we go about doing this? I find I have a tendency to talk about things that are very actionable because I find it's very hard to get started on a problem if I don't have something to try out to do it with. So it'd be pretty silly of me to provide you one tool for finding different options, wouldn't it? So I'm going to try to practice what I preach a little bit here. Anybody heard of popcorn flow before? Popcorn flow is a really interesting tool created by a guy named Claudio Peroni. I think he is Italian and lives in Ireland. And this one, I think, is a really great model for how you think about problems. So they actually come up, he actually has a visualization for how we talk about experiments and retrospectives. This is oriented around retrospectives from the beginning. Come up with problems and observations, spawn options, spawn possible experiments, commit to experiments, and then the rest of it is sort of a visualization of us executing on those experiments. See a few people taking pictures. I'll pause for a few seconds before the next slide. You'll also get the slides. This is the part I want to focus on because I think this is where the value is. I think the other part is valuable in visualizing the actual work when we're doing it, but this is the part to me which is where the magic happens. Oh, right, I forgot to point out. So it's actually you can see the whole thing spells out popcorn, right? Except it actually spells popcorned because there's a done on the end. But actually, if you look real closely, there's a fun one here. It's actually problems and observations, so it really spells poop corn. I don't know how Claudio felt about that when I tweeted it at him, but I thought it was pretty funny. So I want to focus on this part of it, problems and observations. We come up with whatever the issue is, whatever we've seen, whatever problem we're trying to solve, whatever impact we're trying to have. Just checking my time. And then we spawn potential options. What are all the different ways we can come up with of solving this? Again, no bad ideas at this stage. And then options can actually spawn into multiple experiments. So I'll just show you a little bit what that looks like. This is having done a retrospective. We have a few different teams. Why it went A, B, F, I don't really remember, but we have a few different teams, and they all sort of eventually decided on what their biggest problem or observation was that they wanted to come up with. And then they spawned a whole ton of options. They came up with every possible way they could think of addressing this problem. Every possible option. Then they got into very actionable experiments, specific things that we are going to do. We're going to try doing code reviews for a period of 2 weeks, and at the end of the 2 weeks, we're going to do a thumb vote to figure out whether it worked or not. Very actionable experiments. Claudio advocates the smaller these things are, the better. He talks a lot about like doing them in the course of days rather than weeks, but that's up to yourself, I think. And you can see, I mean, it feels like you could get a lot of stuff from spawning every potential option, but it actually starts to narrow on its own when you get to the possible experiments part. Options tends to go pretty broad, but once we start spawning possible experiments, people tend to narrow the focus entirely on their own. Oh, right. So that's popcorn flow, and this is sort of a really good mental model. I've had teams who use this not just for retrospectives, but when they're talking about a user story and how to solve a particular user story, they'll spawn all the potential options that they can come up with. And then they'll say, okay, how can we actually test if this option's a good idea? These are the potential experiments. Probably a lot of you are familiar with the Fishbone, where we talk about problems from various different perspectives. I like to use the Fishbone a little bit differently. Again, I like to use the Fishbone when we're talking about identifying the right problem. So this is a retrospective where we've talked about what are the issues we see with the people, what are the issues that we see with the process, what are the issues we see in the environment, measurement issues, whatever these sort of categories you want to have is. And then we go into a separate Fishbone where we talk about potential solutions. So basically in this one, office noise was the one that was voted as the most important, that there's too much noise in the office. And then these are all potential ways to solve the problem of too much noise in the office, looked at from different angles. Gallery walk is very similar to Fishbone. It's about looking at problems from different angles, but it's a little bit more physical and involves a little bit more movement, which I quite like. Basically, you create a poster that focuses on a different angle of a problem, process, investments, measurements, environments, these types of things. You create a poster, and then you divide up into small groups, and each group spends some time at each individual poster discussing the problem from that angle, and this helps them kind of come up with new ideas about the problem that they might not have come up with otherwise. 5 hows. You're actually the first group to see this. I added this to the slides literally like 3 minutes before this presentation started. 5 hows is a fun little idea that I came up with. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 5 whys, where we talk about a problem to try to find the root cause. We continue to ask the question, why, over and over again, which, by the way, a lot of people really hate. Do a little side story. My girlfriend used to work for the government, and they were doing a lean transformation, and it was one of these very typical, right? Somebody decided a framework, and they bought a lot of real expensive consultants who came in and told everybody how to solve the problem, right? And 2 of the tools they had were Fishbone and 5 whys. The Fishbone one was really fun. She told me one day, people have stopped raising problems because we know we're going to be forced to Fishbone it, which is really quite mad, right? I mean, that's the exact opposite of what you're trying to accomplish with that tool. But 5 whys was a fun one because she always thought it was really silly. She didn't enjoy the education she got. And of course, we had a lot of discussions about this. And so she used to do this thing where we'd be just having any random discussion at home. And she'd go, why? 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 You see how annoying that is? I do think 5 whys is a good tool. It's not just about saying why over and over again. Anybody who has children shuts down immediately when you start having that conversation, right? They know what that's like. It's about asking deeper questions. And I do think it's a good tool in that way. You know, once you identify the problem, ask why 5 times, and this will get you to the real problem is the idea. And then 5 hows is, once you've identified the real problem, come up with 5 different ways to solve the problem. Don't settle for one way to solve the problem. Try to come up with 5 different ways to address this problem. This will get your team thinking outside the box, thinking about things from a different angle. It'll get people the option of getting their problem up on the table. Find 5 different ways, and that'll get you options. So those are most of the tools I had. I think I'm actually quite ahead of time here, which is good. Well, we got a little bit of time. Before lunch, you always want to try to finish early because, people are getting ravenous and angry. I have a book called Actionable Agile Tools. This contains very actionable tools. It's quite a short book, a lot of pictures. If you come into my workshop in the afternoon, I probably shouldn't announce this to such a big crowd. I have a free copy for everybody who comes to the workshop. But there's a limited amount of people. I tried to bring more, but there's only so many books you can fit in a suitcase when you're getting on an airplane. But if you contact me, I can probably get you a physical copy. But it's free online. If you go to LeanPub, I don't actually have the link there, which is a little silly. I can give it to anybody who asks. If you go to LeanPub, it's a pay-what-you-like model, and you can download the book for free if you like. Obviously, I don't mind if you decide to pay some money for it, but that's entirely up to you. And it contains a list of very actionable tools. I also have a new workshop around actionable agile tools that I'm trying to get off the ground, and I'm trying to, this is my MVP here in both Kaunas and Vilnius. Basically, my MVP is I need to figure out if people actually want to do this and if it's something of interest to you. So if you're interested in a workshop called 50 Tools That Every Scrum Master Should Know, I have Post-it notes along the front of the stage. After we finish doing question time, come on up, write your email address on the Post-it note, and just drop it on the stage, and I'll pick them up, and I'll contact you to see if you're actually interested in the workshop. Post-it notes are not GDPR compliant, unfortunately, but I am. These do not go into some sort of massing mailing list system. These are dealt with by me personally as a person. If you don't like an email you got from me, you email me, I'll remove it. That's basic policy that I have. So that's pretty much it. So let's talk questions. Be comfortable. We are friendly. I feel like I was pretty friendly, right? That wasn't the best response, but okay, sure. That's a little better. When do you come up with solutions? During a retro? Yeah, again, this depends a little bit on what the context we're talking about is, right? If I'm doing a retrospective, then I have a part of it that's focused on finding the right problem, and I have a part of it that's focused on finding the right solution. If I am doing a sprint planning meeting, then I have a part of the sprint planning meeting that's focused on talking about the problem, identifying the impact that we want to have, and then I have a part of it where we explore various options. So it depends a little bit what we're trying to accomplish. I don't know what to say to that one. I feel like nobody wants to buy that tool, right? Distributed teams. So I work in a distributed team right now, and actually I found this to be a really great tool in distributed teams. So all of our retros that we do, we use this approach. It requires a lot of flexibility. So the problem in distributed teams is never really the distribution, I think. It's the inability to adapt things on the fly. So what we do a lot for our retrospectives is we actually just have a Google drawing, and then I have some pre-made shapes and things like that they can sort of cut and paste in order to, basically I'm trying to create the Post-it note environment online. But we always do this approach when we're doing problems in our retrospective. So we talk about it, people throw some stuff up, they say what they think the problem is, then we'll have a little bit of discussion around it, then we'll do a vote, and we'll say which of these is the most important thing for us to continue to talk about. We'll do some kind of vote like that. We'll pick one. We'll explore that problem a little bit more in depth. We use a tool like 5 Whys or just an open discussion that's facilitated to try to get more information on the specific problem. Then we'll go into options generation. And then everybody will throw up their cards on what they think the different options are for solving it. And then we do as I mentioned earlier, I like to give people the chance to say, no, this is not okay with me. So what we do then is I say, there's like little red dots in the Google drawing. Is there anything here that you guys think is dangerous? You could not live if we did this experiment. It's a real problem for you. Throw up a red dot. I also always say to people, you don't have to explain a red dot. Like, to you, it's the strongest statement you can possibly make. I would not want to be in this team anymore if we did this. I would not want to be in this company anymore if we did this. I think that this is dangerous. And then I give everybody the chance to do that. Unfortunately, since it's Google Drawings, you can see who's moved the thing around, which is still not optimal, but you know, you do the best solution that you can. So yeah, I use this in, oh, somebody posted the link to the book. Well, you got rid of that real fast. It's on LeanPub. Could you propose some tools and advices for retros in distributed teams? I could attach some materials afterwards. My main tip in working with distributed teams, and I'll be honest, I don't love working in a distributed team. It is not my favorite way to work. I think that we talk about co-location in Agile for a reason. I think it solves a lot of problems just simply by being physically together. There are some benefits to distribution, but to me, I've never felt like they outweigh the downsides. But my main tool for working in a distributed team is be prepared. You cannot just show up to a meeting and hope it's going to go well when it's in a distributed team. Much, much more preparation is required to even host a retrospective. You need to be well prepared. You need to understand what the times are. You need to build tools that allow for the flexibility and that type of thing. Being prepared is really important in distributed teams because you can't just say, okay, let's change the whole format of the meeting. Grab some Post-it notes, move things around. You can't actually do that. So, oh, there it goes again. Can not only Scrum Masters write emails? Yeah, absolutely. If it sounds like an interesting workshop to you, you're most welcome. That's just the title of it. It's for Agile coaches, Scrum Masters, anybody who really is interested in tools to help them work. And I've been sort of trying to expand lately the different areas that I work with. Like moving outside of IT. I've applied, I don't know if anybody's seen Henrik Kniebag's post Agile at Home, where he tries to apply Agile methods to his home life. This is something that I've most definitely experimented with. What's my time like? I could tell a little. It's getting a little tight. But me and my girlfriend for a long time used a Kanban board for trying to improve our apartment. And we did basically a work in process limit around apartment improvement projects so that we didn't have too many things on the go at one time. She got to be, this is how I pitched it if you want to try this. She got to be product owner, so she gets to decide everything we do in the order in which we do it. Pretty hard to say no to, right? And the only limitation is that she has to follow the width limit that's on the board. So this came up because, you know, we're trying to redo our whole apartment. We lived in an apartment she had lived in for 30 years. She inherited it from her parents when they moved out. She went to university and kept the apartment, which was great for a while, until one day we looked around and realized we had a 70s apartment from IKEA, you know? So we're trying to replace everything. One day, it was going really slowly, and one day I thought, we haven't bought a new couch yet, but we've just purchased our 5th set of curtains. I don't know if this is a thing in Lithuania, but in Sweden, you've got winter curtains and summer curtains and fall curtains and Christmas curtains and Easter curtains. Apparently, you need 50 different kinds of curtains. I've never understood why. Anyway, so you have to follow the work in process limit, and if you do that, you're in charge of everything, and we get to do it. Anyway, we did this. After a year, we made more progress than we had in like 5 years. We did so well on this that I was given a 92-inch screen in the living room and a surround sound system as a thank you for coming up with this brilliant system that allowed us to improve our apartment. I was very pleased with the whole situation. That was a really long tangent there, but what the point is, yes, I think that this is applicable in a lot of contexts that are not work contexts, to bring it back to the actual question. Oh, wow. I don't know how to answer that. My favorite Agile tool, I mean, I guess it depends on how you define a tool, but I think that the idea of continuous improvement, yeah, this is so tough, because now I also want to say visualization. No, but I do think that the idea of continuous improvement and how we practice continuous improvement and experimentation and making changes and always trying to improve things is just, to me, it's you know, my whole philosophy of being. It's not even just about Agile, right? This idea of reflecting on your problems and then doing concise experiments to try to do something about it really did change my whole outlook on the world. So I'm going to go with retrospectives, Kaizen. I think I already did that one. Okay, I think we're done. That was all of them. We have lots of time for more questions if you guys want to. I finished way earlier than expected. Anybody want to do an audience question? You have to use the mic for the camera.
Yeah, you talked about retro, so can you describe any technique which you use? I mean, which is preferable for you, like MadSat or something like else?
So I'm very big on the popcorn flow one. I use that a lot. Basically, I use this a lot in retrospectives. You know, we generate just what we think the problems and observations are, then we spawn potential options, then we spawn experiments and commit to them and then actually run them through our process of doing them. I'm very big on that. I use a lot of different tools. So I have a basic practice that I do in retrospectives. So my team, I think that, how do I describe this? So I think it's very important to have a basic retrospective that you do, like a standard format, because you don't want to teach the team how the retrospective works every single time you want to do one, right? Like, it's interesting to do cool new things and experiment with new stuff, but the team doesn't want to relearn how a retrospective works every 2 weeks or every week when you do them. So what I usually practice in my teams is I have a standard retrospective, like a basic format that we use, and we'll do that every second time, and then we'll do something experimental every second time. The experimental ones, I either look online or I invent them myself. Very often I'll try to have them to focus on a specific thing, like something I've observed in the team that I think is important to solve. So I don't have a direct answer to your question, but that's because I use like hundreds of different retro tools. But it is really good to have a default one as well, I think.
One additional to that one, I mean, what about accountability? I mean, who will be accountable for the, I mean, you have one option considered that one, so who will be the owner?
One more time, please.
I mean, you will have an option which you will go for, and so who will be a Scrum Master or anyone from the team who will actually...
So who actually drives the thing? So this is the interesting thing with popcorn flow, and maybe it's not obvious from this picture, but basically, I don't know if this is going to work for the camera, but I'm going to try it. Basically, once we commit to stuff, this actually becomes a visualization that we can use in our team area. So we put these up like physically on our board. I have a remote team right now, so we use Jira, but we've got our options, our experiments along the top of the board, and we talk about them every day in our stand-up meeting. So we say, what's happening with this experiment? Is this something we're actually doing? And then they sort of, you know, move along into ongoing, and then we actually review them and see if they worked, and so on and so forth. So we create the accountability. I used to be really big on assigning drivers to retro items, less so now. We create the accountability by having a part of the retrospective where we talk about it every day. And, you know, there's one right now with my current team where they had asked me to send out a bunch of different links about mob programming so they could learn more about it. So my part of that was to send out the links to research it and stuff. And now every day we have it that comes up in the retro, and every team member has to go, yeah, no, I still haven't done that. So it's, you know, the accountability comes through the embarrassment in some way of I still haven't actually finished it. I think we got another question there.
Yeah, thanks.
You have to take the microphone.
Just a clarifying question. So do you build this into the sprint backlog, or how do you figure out how to prioritize the stuff that you do in your retros from the popcorn in regards to all the other stuff that you have to do?
Good question. I think we naturally, you're right, everybody heard the question. I don't need to repeat it. I think we naturally don't ever come out with too many things. There's always some time of our retrospective that is dedicated to continuous improvement. We don't have a specific time for that. Like we don't measure how much that time is, but everybody understands we couldn't invest the entire sprint in continuous improvement. So we're only ever taking out maybe 2 or 3 items per sprint, often even just 1 item per sprint and investing in that one. I'm also always encouraging the teams to do things that pay back. Right? If we're trying to make an improvement, let's get it so that it pays for itself so that next time we have more time, you know, like reducing technical debt and these types of things. I think he's got more. And then I'll go to this one, and then we'll go to this.
Very quick. So you keep a separate backlog for these things, or you put it into the sprint?
No, this goes, so so this goes into our into the same visualization that we use for all other work, and I've become very fond of doing this. I think that it's a much better way. I've never understood why we treat continuous improvement like it's different work from all the other. It's work that needs to be done. So we put it in the same place, we see it in the same spot. We used to do, when we did Popcorn Flow, we used to do it separately, but eventually I've migrated with my current team to always just, and we put it at the top. It's the top swim lane on our board, so we can always see that it's important. Now I answered your question. Yes, great. I'll do this one, and then we go to Chris. How do you solve the problems when the developers say that co-location takes away from concentration for their work? So, great question. First of all, I don't solve it by discounting this and by saying that the developers are just being difficult. Their focus time is extremely important. There's nothing worse than getting your flow ruined when you're working on something. It just destroys productivity. I think that the flow time is very, very important, and I think that far too often we have this tendency to think that that's just our developers being difficult, that they don't ever want to have a meeting and stuff like that. We work very hard to make sure that if we're having meetings, that they're valuable meetings, that there's a purpose to having them, that they run well, and that the people who need to be in the meeting are there, and that if they're not going to a meeting, then we're reflecting on what's causing that. We're not blaming the people, we're blaming there's something wrong with the actual meeting. But yeah, I think we have a tendency to use a lot of headphones. We have in our current team like a communication policy around how communication works. We don't specifically have anything about headphones, but like the unwritten rule is if I'm wearing my headphones, then try not to interrupt me. We have some guidelines around like when you actually ping on Slack versus send a message somebody can see later. We try to use email in a smart way not to interrupt people. I can't say as I've ever had any discussions about whether it's co-location related or not. I think even when you're not co-located, there's no shortage of interruptions in a day. We try, Chris. Oh, I want to answer that last one.
When you're doing Popcorn Flow and you commit to an experiment, if that experiment looks like it's solved the problem, do you still go on to try some other experiments for that same problem, or do you just leave it there?
What we generally, the way we try to see it is this still important enough to focus on? No, I think if we feel that something is no longer our biggest problem, we would never spend more energy focusing on that. I think we would always say, what's our next biggest problem? But if we did an experiment, even if it improved the problem, and we still said, this is our biggest problem, then we would do more experiments to improve the problem. So, this is a great question that I wish I had a lot more time to think about. Can you explain a Scrum Master as you would explain it to a 5-year-old or an old lady? So this, I'm going to tell a little side story to try to get out of answering this question. When I was home on vacation in Canada over the summer, I was with my girlfriend, and they were having some kind of a discussion, and her mom was trying to prove a point about your friends probably don't know what your boyfriend does for a living, and she was talking about somebody entirely different, right? But she was trying to prove the point of like, well, do you think your brother knows what Jeff does for a living? And my girlfriend responded, nobody knows what Jeff does for a living. Jeff can't even explain what he does for a living. Which I think is a pretty fair point. I have an article about this called "Is a Scrum Master a Full-Time Job?" which kind of gets a little bit into this. I think that I really don't feel good answering this question on the spot like this. I think it's a really complicated question. I try to help the group improve. I try to help a team improve so that they can get better at their job and they can be more effective in their work. And that's what I focus on. So I don't focus on the job that they do. I focus on the job of how they do that job and try to create improvements for the whole team. That's not an explanation an old lady's going to like. So I don't think we're out of time. No, we still got 5 minutes if you guys want to do another one. Oh, this is the worst part.
Right, guys, show some love for Jeff. I mean,
Thanks.
great presentation, right?
Cheers.